Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. My name is Carl Stitchin and I'm the Director of IALS. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Director's Series of Seminars, a monthly remote event on the Institute calendar. This is our final seminar for this academic year. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a great pleasure today to welcome remotely to the Institute Professor Ambrina Manji, a great legal scholar, a great friend of the Institute, and a friend of mine. Ambrina has been a professor of land law and development at Cardiff University since 2014. Before that, she was director of the British Academy's British Institute in Eastern Africa. Her research is in African law and society, including work on law in African literature, African history, legal education, and women in the law. Her most recent book is The Struggle for Land and Justice in Kenya, which has been widely hailed as an intellectually transformative work. At Cardiff, Ambrina co-founded the Law and Global Justice Centre, which established Cardiff's path-breaking global justice pro bono program. The centre also launched its socio-legal journal's Global South initiative in 2018 with writing workshops for early career scholars, in which I was honoured to participate as one of the visitors. Ambrina's paper today is entitled Searching for Care Labour in African Social History. She'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and questions can be raised by our audience members in the Q&A function at any time. I will then attempt to moderate the questions in the discussion period. The seminar is scheduled for 90 minutes. Closed captioning should be available at the bottom of your screen. So with that, by way of introduction, welcome, Ambrina. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Colin. It's great to be at the Institute, albeit remotely, and thank you to all of you for attending this afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen and we can make a start. So I hope you can all see that. Great. Okay, so I'm going to speak today about some work I've done very recently, which listening to Carl speaking just now made me think is actually a piece of work that brings together a lot of my differing interests, different strands of my work over the years. And that is work that I'm doing in developing methods for rereading what I think are some key texts in African social history. So this is really a kind of historical turn in my scholarship. And I'm going to give you today an example of one of those tasks of rereading. And you can tell me when we have our discussion about whether you find this a plausible way of working, a plausible method. And I'd be very interested in hearing from you on that, because this work that's very much in its infancy. I'm still starting out on this sort of work, and particularly on this sort of method. So in my own mind, I'm not settled on how productive it's likely to be. So it would be very valuable to have that discussion with you. So to make a start, what I do today is a rereading of a text that many of you will know, which is a text about the burial of the Nairobi lawyer Sylvanus Otieno. Right for you. Okay, so this is Sylvanus Otieno, Nairobi lawyer, practiced in Nairobi, died in Nairobi in December 1986. His Luo relatives, his relatives from his side of the family, if you like, who were Luo, wished to bury him in his rural homeland of Siaya in the west of Kenya in accordance with what they held to be Luo custom, the custom of his people. His wife, Wambui, on the other hand, his family wished to bury him in accordance with what they saw as the custom of the Luo in his rural homeland. His wife, on the other hand, was from the Kikuyu people and wished to bury him in their urban home in Nairobi. She went to court to seek permission to do this, but the family couldn't agree. The course of events can be summarized as follows. On it becoming apparent after his death that his family and his clanspeople differed as to the approach as to where to bury Silvanus Otieno, widely known as SM. His widow sought an injunction in the High Court, restraining the clan from removing his body from Nairobi City mortuary, and a declaration that she was in fact the one entitled to bury her husband's body at their farm in Ngong near Nairobi. Her application succeeded. Upon the clan's application, the Court of Appeal set aside the High Court ruling and ordered that the matter be set down for trial. The judge then directed that the deceased body should be handed over to the clan and the widow jointly or either of them separately for burial in the west of Kenya, in Siaya. The clan's wishes, in other words, were granted. And then his wife appealed, and the Court of Appeal dismissed that appeal and ordered that the lawyer be buried in Western Kenya, in Siaya, in accordance with the law custom. Commenting on the case, the author of a very famous casebook on Kenyan customary law, Eugene Kotra, described the case as a landmark both for customary law in Kenya and for Kenyan legal history. And I have, if you're interested in that discussion of customary law, have written extensively on the customary law aspects of this case. That's about 20 years ago now that I first wrote about it. But a recent invitation from the journal African Studies to reflect on this book prompted me to revisit the case. So this book was published about the law case 30 years ago. And so the journal, I think in what is a very creative and interesting idea, have decided that they will commission authors to write reflection pieces on key texts as their anniversaries come up. And I was asked to reflect on this text and to think about what it might reveal to us now, 30 years after it was first published. Bear in mind that I first wrote about this case, about Otieno's contested burial 20 years ago from a law and literature perspective. Since that time, Kenya has inaugurated a new constitution. And as I write, in the last few weeks, it has defended that constitution from assault by the executive in the Supreme Court. In 1987, the SM Otieno case similarly captured the public imagination. So just as in the last few months, we have seen Kenyan citizens watch with great knowledge the discussions in our High Court, in our Court of Appeal, and in our Supreme Court about the defense of the Constitution or the attempts to amend it. Just as we've been watching that, back in 1987, we also watched ordinary citizens, ordinary in Kiswahili raia, following every twist and turn of the SM Otieno case in very well-informed terms about what was taking place in the courtroom. And I know this because I remember myself being absolutely glued to the newspapers following the reports of the case, often transcribed in the newspapers without any necessarily any commentary, actually just the case law transcribed in the newspapers for citizens to follow. And I can clearly remember how much interest ordinary citizens expressed in the case as it took its twists and turns. Writing in an afterpiece in the Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo book, John Lonsdale has suggested that their text, their reflections on this case, offers us insights into what they describe as exemplary, daily, plebiscitary making of a national culture. And I think the same can be said, as it was about watching the Otieno case, the same can be said about Kenyans in recent months watching the way in which debates on the Constitution have taken place before the courts. During the hearings on the constitutionality of the Constitution of Kenya Amendment Bill 2020, popularly known as the BBI case, before the High Court and then all the way up to the Supreme Court, tens of thousands of Kenyans turned in to watch the live stream of the case. So we might expand on John Lonsdale's observation about the making, a daily making of a national culture, to observe or remark optimistically on the long-term, daily, plebiscitary making of what I would call Kenya's legal culture. So I want to bring these two things together, the way in which we've engaged with BBI and the way in which back in the day we thought about and talked about the Otieno case. So 30 years after it was published, I've taken the opportunity to reread Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo's text, not in order to ask, as many commentators have asked about this case, what was the case really about? But actually instead to do something different, to take the opportunity to explore what Schuyler Marx has suggested to us as a way of approaching text, and that is to ask ourselves, as new questions, and I'm using her words here, as new questions break the surface, is it possible to suggest new ways of hearing or seeing old stories? I want to suggest that a productive reconsideration of Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo's text can be offered by rereading this text as a social reproduction text. I draw inspiration in doing this from David McNally's work in suggesting that one way of reading, for example, Angela Davis' germinal text, Women, Race and Class, would be to insist, because of this text's historical materialist orientation and its overriding emphasis on the interplay of the production of value and the reproduction of human beings, that Angela Davis's text, Women, Race and Class, might be considered a social reproduction text. So to make that suggestion about a new way of understanding this text. And I think there are a number of reasons why it's compelling to revisit Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo in this way. First of all, the SM Otieno case at the time clearly turned to a large extent on differing interpretations of the idea of home, as the authors very clearly show in their text. In trying to assert or to work out what were Otieno's wishes, what were his own wishes about where he wished to be buried, which is arguably, Cotran says, the correct position, the correct question to ask in customary law, it was hoped that we could read off, the court could read off from where Otieno himself understood his home to be, his own wishes about where he wished to be buried. Now, clearly in social reproduction theory, and I'll come on to talk about social reproduction theory in a minute, in social reproduction theory, the household is a critical unit of analysis. The concerns of social reproduction theory are neatly summed up in Tithi Bhattacharya's articulation of its key question. So Tithi Bhattacharya has argued that the key question of social reproduction theory is to ask, if workers' labor is what produces all the wealth in society, who then produces the worker? How does familial and communitarian labor reproduce the worker, and how do we make visible labor and work that is analytically hidden by classical economists and politically denied by policymakers? Effective relations and the conditions under which reproductive labor are provided are neglected and under-researched. The household or the home is a central unit of this analysis. So we must understand home in this way of reading. We must understand home as political economy. What I do in my paper is to build on this theoretical insight and on our existing recognition that the Otieno case was about ideas of home, but I extend this analysis to provide a further elaboration of Cohen and Otieno's text as an important text of social reproduction, as itself a social reproduction text, because of the attention that it pays to affective ties, to the everyday work of maintaining life, which includes, I would argue, the work of stewardship over death. It's in the nature of the everyday labor of maintaining life that we find social reproduction theory's most startling insight. So Bhattacharya, using a range of authors, has summed up social reproduction or social reproductive labor as the activities, the behaviors, the emotions, the responsibilities, the relationships directly involved in maintaining life on a daily basis and maintaining life intergenerationally. This involves various types of social necessary work, physical, emotional, mental, aimed at providing historically and socially as well as biologically the means of maintaining and reproducing a population. So, among other things, social reproduction involves how food, clothing, shelter are made available for consumption, how the maintenance and socialization of children is done, how care of the elderly and the infirm is provided, and how sexuality is socially constructed. And I think that part of the way of accounting for the excitement or the interest in the SM case in around 1987 was that it provided a powerful glimpse into what I think was contested social reproductive work, a contest within a family about what social reproductive work is, and then about what are the rights to which it gives rise. And this work, as Prabha Koteswaran has very insightfully written, this work is unique. This kind of work is unique because it engages emotion. And that, to me, accounts for much of the reason for the way in which the case captured the public imagination in the late 80s. And I have here taken from a really very interesting documentary, which I recently came across, some snapshots of the way in which the case was attended and lived in Kenya in the late 80s. So many of us will remember huge crowds outside the courtroom, people absolutely following blow by blow every evening the court's deliberations on their television screens, reading the newspapers, and so on. As I've already said, an important theme running through both the SM case itself, the Otieno case itself, and also the text, Cohen and Otieno Odhiambo's text, is the idea, which is often presented in the case in the alternative, of house or home. For the clan, it was important to distinguish between Otieno's place in Nairobi, which to them was simply his home, simply his house, simply a house, and his rural home in Siaya in Western Kenya, which they considered to be his home, his true home. So, for example, the clan, giving evidence in the matter, insisted under examination that when they went to visit the lawyer, Otieno, in his Nairobi residence, that was his house, not his home. His home was where his people were from, where his ethnic group were from, and where he should therefore be buried. And this question of the meaning of home for different peoples of Kenya, greatly occupied the court and the ordinary citizen listening to the case. Whilst the court heard evidence of the etymology and the meaning of home, both in Otieno's language of Jaluo and in English, the authors remind us that the discourse on how home had such broad salience for Kenyans, we could take as evidence what's been greatly noted after the case, that after the trial, there was greatly intensified activity across Kenya as members of the middle class in particular sought to develop their rural homes. In an important sense, they were intensifying or confirming, the authors say, the ideology or the idea that their home was their rural home, their true home was their rural home, an idea that ran throughout the litigation. In this sense, the contest in the courts and also on the streets offered a very powerful oration of the idea that Kenyans, and particularly the middle class, took on board of the importance of establishing what Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo describe as a middle-class home of quality and of meaning. And it's interesting to note as well that this question of what is home, what is a house, is your urban place of residence only your house? This question spawned a huge academic literature after the case. At a conference at Nairobi Law School after the case had ended, scholars presented papers on the semantics of the word home in English and Jaluo. So if home was a place, was a central theme, home as a place was a central theme of the Otieno case and a central theme of Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo's book, I want to suggest that what was obscured nonetheless in both these readings, the legal reading and the scholarly reading, was any conception of home as a site of labor. Home in the SM case was a place, a location, but not a site of work. The feminist scholars Shireen Rai, Catherine Hoskins, and Dania Thomas have defined the work that goes on in a home as uncounted work, unaccounted and uncounted work, which involves the provision of emotional, affective services that are required in order to maintain intimate relationships. And we can see throughout the case the nature of this work very clearly, and we can see it particularly clearly in the intimacies of the funeral work that was described through the case. Throughout the case, funeral practices are read, and this is my critique of the case, if you like. The work of the funerary work is read as pertaining to rites and custom rather than read and presented as reproductive work. They're described in ethnographic detail in the testimony of witnesses giving evidence on Luo funeral practices, and they are contested by Wambui and her lawyer in trying to make the case for burying Otieno in Nairobi. On this reading, Wambui's wish to bury her husband arose not out of her understanding of customary law, or much less her understanding of ethnography, but actually her assertion of her rights were engaged because she saw her right to bury him as an extension of the quotidian labor that she had done during her lifetime. In other words, she wasn't engaging with his status as a Luo, as a lawyer, as a husband. She was simply asserting her right to bury him, not because of customary law, but as an extension of or an outcome of the labor that she had provided during his lifetime. Evidence of Wambui's reproductive labor can be found, for example, in the case, in the works that she relates to the court that she did in relation to learning about Otieno's family. So bear in mind here that Wambui comes from one ethnic group, marries into another. She's one of those early cases of mixed marriages. Some people say, ethnic groups marrying across a kind of a divide. And what Wambui did by way of reproductive labor, I would argue, is that she learned and maintained a genealogy of Otieno's family as an incomer into his ethnic group and into his clan. In the court, she was able to provide a detailed, what has been described as a detailed and annotated map of the social world of the kin into whom she married. She knew in detail the uncles, the grandparents, the details of their place, where they lived, who they were related to. People say you learn the details of feuds, family feuds going back through the years. You learn a detailed, annotated map of the social world of those into whom you marry. And this, I would argue, is reproductive labor. The maintenance of effective ties, the creation of effective ties. She came in as a stranger and got to know them. And in so doing, she's able to transmit, or putting herself in a position where she will transmit generational knowledge about those amongst whom she now lives. That I see as reproductive labor. But Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo read it, on the contrary, in decidedly public terms, describing Wambui as having an ability to exercise her expertise on the issues about her husband's family, describing her as thus proving that she was substantially constituting herself as a Luo citizen. They read her in decidedly public terms by making that assertion. She became Luo. She's a Luo citizen by virtue of the reproductive work, not that they use this term, the work that she's done. I would argue that we need to reframe those terms by reading Wambui from within this valorized and masculine public world where notions of clan and citizenship are operative. The authors, I think, entirely miss the comparatively undervalued private female world into which Wambui provided her labor. And in fact, the Luo have a term for that work that is done by a woman who marries into a family. And that word in Jalua is the word pim. In this role, Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo write, the Luo recognize that a woman is able to impart history, wisdom, knowledge to the children of the home. A Pim is recalled as a woman who comes into a household from a social and sometimes geographical distance, as indeed Wambui did. She's often an outsider, but in time she learns the law, L-O-R-E, the law of her new household. And instead, what we see in the case and in the way that the case has been read by commentators is, rather than to recognize Wambui's work as social reproductive work, instead to read it as qualifying her for a public claim, a claim of citizenship to the Luo people. And I think that entirely misses what might have been going on in the case. To give another example of a rare glimpse that we get into the everyday world of the household in the midst of this case, what the case, rereading it now, what I think the case gives us is a glimpse into the home and a glimpse into the Otieno household. And many of you will remember from the time the case was ongoing, because we followed the cast of characters as the case went on. Central to the case was a woman called Mama Coco. Mama Coco gave testimony in the case. Her proper name was Mariamu Murikira. She worked only occasionally in the home of the Otieno's as a cook. In the rest of her time, she owned a kiosk in the town, in the city, and she sold food there. And from time to time, she was close to the couple. She traveled with them back and forth to their rural home, and then worked with them occasionally in their home in Nairobi as their cook. She was manifestly a close confidant of Wambui's. We might even describe her in Janet Budra's formulation as pseudo-kin. She was so close that she was almost kin. In the case, she has very ordinary status. She's just a working class woman in the city. But that gave, Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo noticed this, gave her evidence unique authority. And it was she who testified that the lawyer had told her that he didn't want to build a house in Western Kenya because he had built one in Nairobi, and he wanted to be buried in the city. He didn't want to be buried in Luoland. And the authors describe Mama Coco as having what they call the ordinary intelligence urban Nairobi. She was urban and she was urbane. She struggled to comprehend, survive, and succeed through struggle in the spaces left open, the authors say, disdained and created by the prominent, the privileged, and the wealthy. So I argue Mama Coco straddles the worlds of waged labor and unwaged reproductive labor. She provides her services in the Otieno household, and at the same time, she is an interlocutor and a confidant of the couple, and especially of Wambui. The Otieno home in Nairobi is not a bounded space. Mama Coco was in the house. She overheard arguments between visitors. She was present when the burial was discussed. She was sufficiently intimate with the couple to converse with them about why they were building a home in Nairobi. She had unique insights into the question of where the lawyer considered to be his true home. And I think on this task of rereading the text so many years later, I think we recognize in Mama Coco Wanjiku. Wanjiku is the name we give to the every woman of Kenya's constitutional struggle. So just to summarize who Wanjiku is, Wambui Mwangi has described Wanjiku as follows in her absolutely beautiful essay in the New Inquiry. In the 1990s, the then President Daniel Arap Moi dismissed popular pressure for constitutional reform by demanding, what does Wanjiku want with a constitution? In other words, what does the ordinary woman in the street know about constitutional law and these constitutional demands for social and economic rights as well as political and civil rights? Why, in other words, this is a concern and a preoccupation of the middle classes and the educated, and it doesn't speak to the wider Kenyan citizenry. Unwittingly, Wambui Mwangi says, the president had created a defiant symbol. Wanjiku was enthusiastically adopted by proponents of constitutional reform as a kind of anti-Moi. They demanded social justice and a new constitution on her behalf. Wanjiku became ubiquitous in the Kenyan public imagination, a way of gesturing to public opinion and the common person, or the ordinary mwananchi, the ordinary citizen in Swahili. And I think there are interesting parallels reading back our constitutional struggles over the last 30 years in parallel with rereading the SM Otieno case. Like Mama Coco in the Otieno case, Wanjiku is Kenya's every woman. So Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo describe Mama Coco as the voice of those who are subject to the actions of the powerful, but never powerful themselves. She is alert to the cost of living and the quotidian preoccupations of daily life. For Wambui Mwangi, Wanjiku is a private citizen with a view of public actors. So she's a private citizen, but she understands public actors and holds them to account, as this wonderful cartoon tries to express. So she comments on social trends. She's a private critic of the public society out there. She straddles, or she manifests the unacknowledged instability between public and private concerns, as Mwangi puts it. So in the late 80s, Mama Coco, for me, is a precursor to Wanjiku. It's perhaps because of the power that Mama Coco commanded as she straddled the public and the private, productive and reproductive spheres, that the lawyer for the clan, Richard Quach, felt the need constantly in the case to reassert the public sphere, the male sphere, by treating her with nothing short of disdain. So when she commented that she ran a kiosk in the city, the lawyer suggested, well, it's better for you to concentrate on that work instead of coming here to try to interpret the wishes of the powerful as to where they wanted to be buried. And he closed his remarks with a bit of a flourish by saying, I would like it to be put on the records of the court that I have never eaten in a kiosk. This disdain with which Mama Coco is treated in the case, for me, really strongly echoes the disdain which inaugurated the creation of Wanjiku a few years later. I want to suggest that reading Cohen and Atieno Odhiambo's text as a social reproduction text allows us to refine how the case was about home, about the labor that goes on in a home, and about the rights to which that gives rise. In short, it allows us to challenge the silences that have been constructed about the effective ties that sustain a home. So in 2022, many of the text's concerns resonate in new ways. And we can understand these resonances by reference to Kenya's own history, most importantly, her constitutional history since the publication of the book. We read the SM Otieno case differently now, because Bomas of Kenya means something different now to what it did in the late 1980s. In the late 1980s, Bomas of Kenya was a place that the lawyer went so frequently to sit in the bar that there was a small corner of the bar known as SM Corner. But for us, in the intervening years, Bomas has become known as the place where we began the work of constitutional drafting. It became a venue for the process of constitution making, to which it's in fact given its name. Or we encounter John Kaminwa, who was Wambui's lawyer in the SM case, but we see him again now, much, much older, before the courts in 2021, defending the Constitution in the Supreme Court, in the Court of Appeal. So in other words, the book's themes have not dated. They continue to provide us with powerful insights in light of Kenya's legal history. However, new questions have indeed, to cite Sheila Marks again, have indeed broken the surface when we reread this text in 2022. So having read Burying SM as a social reproduction text, I've been prompted to think about some of the afterpieces which are contained in that book. There are, I think, 6 pieces written by scholars at the end of the Atieno Odhiambo and Cohen book. So Peter Amuka, Martin Chanik, Sally Falk-Moore, John Lonsdale, Karina Kratz, Michael Fisher, all provide afterpieces in which they attempt to interpret and represent the text. And these are presented by the authors in recognition of the fact that the case rested on or can only be understood as an account of the production of history from a particular vantage point, and a recognition that as the years go on, the case will be read differently, or at least the case will continue to contribute to the production of Kenyan history. The continued relevance of this text is beyond doubt. Students of Kenya, of the process of constitution making, of the sociology of law, of the struggles over history and the production of knowledge will all find important insights in the text. In other words, I would follow Lonsdale in saying, this is a terrific text. Read it if you want to understand what it feels like to be on the way to becoming a Kenyan, but I do so understanding that we're still on the way to becoming Kenyan, and that in the process of becoming Kenyan, we must take into account or recognize not just the public expression of that citizenship, but also the practice of generational reproductive labor that underpins that work. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ambrina, for a really fantastic paper. And I'd welcome our audience to raise any questions they have in our Q&A function at any time, and I will try to moderate. But I want to begin. It felt to me that the paper just has several layers to it, which is really makes it very rich. And it reminds me of some of your other work where I feel like I know what's coming, and then oops, there's a sleight of hand, and it turns out, oh, I was wrong. And it's actually far more nuanced than I had thought. So at first, I wrote down, oh, this is about kind of private sort of self-ownership, self-determination versus sort of the collective community, notions of communal rights over the body. And then you kind of pull back another layer, and it becomes clear, oh no, that's not what it's really about at all. This is also about this private, unpaid labor by someone who comes into the home, into the community. I think, oh, well, that's what it's about. But then you pull back another layer with this other character who supplies waged labor in that home as well. And she has her own story, which seems to exist in competition as well. And I think that's really fascinating. Doesn't it also really make us think about the limitations of of notions of rights in this kind of competition of voices and claims and forms of labor?
It does, Carl, but it also points us to what parts of the story we remember over the last 30 years, and those that have been forgotten or allowed to fade. So I remember distinctly. I remember Mama Coco. But I re-encountered her. She had faded from my memory, and then I re-encountered her in the text. And just to share the screen, because this is an important part of the story, share the screen again. If you recall, just to take a look at my slides, we have publicly available Sylvanus Otieno, well known, his wife Wambui Otieno, the president of Kenya at the time of the inauguration of the new constitution, our Supreme Court. Just want to go through to some of the characters. So we have, really interesting footage of the case as it's being heard, including Otieno's family at the funeral in Western Kenya, mourners at the funeral. Here is Otieno's lawyer. Here is Wambui's lawyer. Here's the crowd gathered to watch his body being transported to Western Kenya. But what do we not find anywhere, no matter how far and how hard I looked, is a photograph of Mama Coco. Mama Coco has kind of been erased from history. She's working class Nairobi. And she's simply disappeared from view. Impossible to find a photograph. I think there is a photograph of her in the text itself, but there is nothing available publicly. All of these characters, including Wambui herself, goes on to have a very rich afterlife in the text. She remarried a younger man, etc. She was an exceptionally active member of the political class. She was politically exceptionally active and effective. But what you get here, I think, for me, this was an opportunity to revisit the way in which particular aspects of our history get silenced and erased, and who gets silenced and erased. And Mama Coco, I think, is a really very good example of that. So you're quite right. There is a peeling back of the layers. She does complicate the story. She absolutely does, because she straddles not just the home and public life. She also straddles working class Nairobi and the well-to-do, people who have a choice about where to build a house or a home. She didn't have those choices. She was a working class woman, but she was part of their home. She was privy to their conversations. She was maybe even privy to some of their decision making. So for me, she's a kind of key character in the case. But actually, we've lost sight. I think we're in danger of losing sight of her.
She kind of, much of this paper is really, it troubles the notions of public and private. And Mama Coco seems to be this particularly troubling figure in terms of the public and the private, and the discomfort to those spheres that her presence entails. So in some ways, she's as you describe, a woman in the public sphere. She's a businesswoman with a kiosk, but yet she isn't recognized and given by the lawyers respect as a businesswoman in the public sphere. She's in the private sphere of other people's homes, and no doubt her own home, but she's in other people's homes, and privy to private conversations. But somehow she's not properly part of that private sphere either. So she's this kind of troubling neither public nor private figure in the story.
And not just that, her status is a cause for the lawyers to spar with each other. So on the one hand, Wambui's lawyers call her in evidence because they think her modest status in Kenyan society, her position as a working-class woman, urbane, but certainly not of the same class as Wambui Otieno and Sylvanus Otieno. That will give her evidence some weight. The modesty of her position in society will actually give her evidence some weight. On the other hand, the Klan's lawyer, the family's lawyer do everything they can to diminish her status, to put her down, to treat her with disdain, to laugh at the fact she runs a kiosk, and to remind the court. And of course, there's an interesting question of rhetoric here, that the lawyer knows that outside the courtroom, tens of thousands of Kenyans are listening, and he makes it very clear, almost makes a joke at her expense: I've never eaten in a kiosk. People of my class don't mix with people of her class. So there is, I think, a really, for the case itself, she's a problem, because her status could go either way. The modesty of her status could play either way in the case. But I think it's a very interesting reflection on the Kenyan legal profession, that she is not of their class, manifestly not of their class. So how she is perceived in the courtroom is through completely classed lenses, which is why I think the social reproductive theoretical take might be an interesting one, because what that allows us to do is to go closer to the idea that, yes, she complicates public-private, but also she manages to play both roles. She can be a public figure, a public businesswoman, but she can also be a confidant. She can be pseudo-king of Wambui. She's close enough to them. She's trusted, and we won't even get into the whole question of her ethnicity, which is, again, entirely complicated, not so easy to spell out. But to me, she's a kind of key character that moves through the case.
A question from Farida Banda. Welcome, Farida, who says, fantastic paper as always, Ambrina. And she's going to play devil's advocate in her question, which I'm going to try to be fair to in my interpretation. So she writes, the non-academic reading of the case is that Wambai was a self-regarding middle-class woman who refused to play by the rules by which she had married. Bride wealth had been given for her, so her reproductive labor was acknowledged by the family. She outlawed herself by her unreasonableness. She must have known about the multiple understandings of home and effect, is familial as well as uxorial. Discuss.
It's absolutely, and actually the number of times since I've done this piece that I've had precisely this discussion. But she wouldn't, and I see Grace Musila is with us, she wouldn't be the first troublemaking woman in our history, and she certainly won't be the last. And that's precisely the point, I think, about Wambui, is that she caused trouble. And I don't think it's because she was middle class or self-regarding. I think it was because she had done, I think, she had done the reproductive labor through the years that she saw as therefore entitling her to make the decision about, from within the household unit, which is now the two of them, to make the decision about where her husband should be buried. In other words, she didn't see his family as having made sufficient investment in that aspect of their lives. She had, and so she saw the question of where to bury him not as a question of custom, because, arguably, actually, it is the correct position in customary law, so far as it can be ascertained, that he should be buried in Luo land with his people. But my intention in rereading the text and the case as a social reproduction text is to try to understand how she saw his burial as potentially as an extension of her work, her work in their marriage. And I think once you start to see that, then you don't see her as troublesome any longer. Although I know that out there in the world is very much the idea that Wambui was a troublesome woman, and it's the reason I think why she continued so much in our public imagination to be a figure. Her subsequent marriage, etc., to a much younger man. All of this kind of talk about Wambui stayed with us for so many more years after the case. I don't know if that answers your provocation, Farida, but thank you very much for it. It's a really well-made point.
As you're giving that answer, what struck me is, it's just, again, more layers, more like a prism through which to different ways to look at this. You're a land lawyer, property lawyer. So this, in some ways, you could position her in some ways as quite a kind of traditional Western kind of notion of she has labored and therefore has acquired kind of rights, decision making over the body, which I suppose is different than the notion of stewardship, but it could be in some ways quite a
property analysis,
quite a traditional property analysis. Was any air play of that kind of notion? It's her labor that gives rise to rights.
Yeah. So there's different kinds of property at play here. One is the whole question, as I said, of house and home. He chose to build a place in Nairobi. He didn't invest in a rural home. So there's that property question. And then, as you say, and it's one I haven't really thought through, but property in his body itself. And actually those things at some point may intersect. Her understanding of his body as being Nairobi bound, which and it's difficult to get to this, but which makes you wonder what she believed he got from his rural home, his rural roots. Like, what was her? Because she clearly made great efforts to understand, to be part of that family. She clearly did the reproductive work that's needed by a woman who marries into a new family she made herself an insider. But yes, she asserted property rights over her husband's body. Is one interpretation of this.
Or she is the alternatively, you could say she is the one who is best placed to understand his wishes.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Which, that's what's also, I think really interesting is obviously this has you beautifully position this story in the context of Kenya and Kenyan history. So it's particular, but yet it's also a story of universals, right? It's this, what is more universal than fights over, as any of us who've experienced death in our families, fights over where people are buried, what should happen to them, who knows their wishes best, what a extended family wants. So it's both highly particular, but it feels very universal as well.
Absolutely. So what's very interesting and important here, Carl, just to say is that he was a lawyer, very prominent lawyer, trained in India. So actually, there's a whole thing about the legal profession here. He wasn't of that part of the legal profession in Kenya, which was British trained. He trained in India, came back, but didn't, despite his great status, died without having written a will. So that was why it was why it was difficult to ascertain his wishes. And then it became a clash between his wife's belief that she knew him well enough to understand what his wishes might be, despite not having expressed them in writing, and his clan's assertion, I think, that it didn't matter what his wishes were. this was the proper position in custom. What he had in Nairobi was simply a passing thing. It was not a home. It was a house. He may have been a well-to-do Nairobi lawyer. He may have even built a house in Nairobi, but his true place was in his home with his birth kin.
But that suggests, interestingly, a kind of clash between notions of custom and kinship and a very sort of modernist notion of sort of self-determination over which seems to be, could be said to be playing out here.
That, and of course in Kenya's kind of fraught history in relation to ethnicity, what you get here is rather than rising above ethnicity, you get this case in a way freezing the idea of ethnicity in place. This problem arose because because two people intermarried, right? So that was part of the language that was being used at the time, was, the impossibility of people from different ethnic groups understanding each other. This kind of clash was inevitable in some way. So there are many layers, and of course I haven't even started the work, which you could also do with this case, of how you read that from the position of now, given our election history, given the continued fraught nature of the debate over ethnicity in Kenya, which has been mobilized in such negative ways through every election cycle, right? So what you get here, two people who live entirely in peace until death, in the same way as you get people who live entirely in peace together until an election. I mean, there's another layer of work that could be done there.
So was the case kind of read as a narrative about ethnicity when it happened?
As certainly as I remember it being talked about, very much so. These are two people from two different ethnic groups. And of course, and again, I won't go into the detail of this, but, discussions and rumors about how the president was mobilizing the Luo ethnic group to make the claims in order to kind of widen or create the chasm for his own electoral purposes and his own political purposes. So there was all of this. There were so many different layers of readings depending on where you were as a citizen at the time. But it was another one of these cases, and Kenya has many of them, where rumors and speculation abounded about how this was playing into the hands of and was useful to the political class. So, and I go away from all of that. Actually, that's one of the things I've avoided doing in this paper, precisely because I thought doing that takes us back into the public sphere that Mwangi urges us to try to decenter. How do you go into the home in itself? How do you take seriously the labor in a home?
And it's also got interesting connections, a little more distant connections, but I think interesting nonetheless, around notions of diaspora and home. Which
very
seems to be kind of, in kind of unspoken. They kind of seem to me to be kind of in the background of this as well. About and some of that literature might be
would be really interesting to look at. Yeah. So debates, and this is the universal nature of this, right? Italians in Cardiff saying, this is all fine. I don't mind living my entire life in the valleys of South Wales, but when I die, I want to be buried back in Italy, even though I'm third generation Welsh, right? This is a universal thing. The question of, the question of where you want to be buried crystallizes an awful lot about your sense of your identity, actually, and where you belong. And so, yes, I think there'd be really interesting work to be done about it.
And I can say can make life very challenging for the people you leave behind. You have to try and make this happen.
Precisely, particularly if you decide you're not going to write it down for them, which is what happened here, right? So if it's just a question of scale. In this case, the scale was Kenya, Nairobi, and then his home in the West. But absolutely, you can imagine precisely the same kind of case playing out in relation to a global diaspora.
Yeah. Follow-up question here. Do you think the case would be decided in the same way given the 2010 Constitution increased visibility of human rights?
Gosh. Oh. I think Raphael is going to help me out. I see Raphael is here. He's going to have to help me out here. It's a very, very good question. One of the great battles in the constitutional, in the drafting of the Constitution was precisely the question of the status of customary law, and in particular, the status of religious law. So it was a major project of the right wing, for example, to ensure that there was recognition for Qadi courts. So actually, if a case like this were to reoccur, the terms would be different, but you could imagine the contestation being precisely on this question of the status of customary law, of custom. I don't think there's anything in the Constitution that would prevent that happening. It's a great question. I genuinely don't think that there is. Does the Constitution provide more in the way of recognition of social and economic rights that would allow Wambui's claims to be invested with more weight? Perhaps more easier to run an argument about her contribution, her entitlements because of her role in the home. Given that our courts are going along a progressive path in relation to, for example, property acquired in the course of a marriage, they are going slowly down a more progressive path. So potentially there's more leeway to make a stronger case on these sorts of grounds, social reproduction grounds that I'm trying out for Wambui than in the past. Interesting
that you framed it as property.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a recognition of marital property acquired, property acquired during the course of a marriage gives you, doesn't it? It gives you some way in to the court saying we will look into what happens in the home, be that acquisition of marriage or be that provision of labour or whatever. It just gives a little bit more leeway to move things onto that private sphere ground than what we had at her disposal, because the case was played out very much in the public sphere, in relation to public sphere rights.
I'm going to switch gears to the question, which I thought was fascinating when you kind of set the scene, was the role of this as theatre, the case as theatre, and this. When you talked about the transcription of the proceedings being read, and I wonder if you could just position that a little bit in terms of,
really interesting. So this was back in the day, Carl, when our newspapers always let off a certain amount of ink. So you'd be reading the paper and you'd be so caught up in it that it would literally, you'd have black ink all over your elbows and your hands from reading. But what you were reading, thinking back, what you were reading was not investigative journalism or journalists commenting on the case. What you were reading was literally the court transcript reproduced page after page after page in the newspapers. And that in itself, I think, could be written into a history of, could be told as part of the story of journalism in Kenya in that particular period when political repression was such that actually the papers were really constrained in what they were able and willing to say publicly. And there is one reading of this, which is that this just gave copy. This gave the papers copy. at a politically difficult time. In fact, you might go further and say it would have been sensitive for them to give any interpretation. So they didn't interpret, they didn't mediate the case for you. They simply reproduced it, and then it was left up to the ordinary citizen to draw their own conclusions. And that, I think, is for me, I remember, it was obviously before I studied law, but I remember just thinking, what are we to make of this? You read page after page after page, but nobody tells you what you should make of. I remember really clearly thinking, I don't know what to make of any of these. I don't understand the strategy in the case. I don't understand why the parties are presenting it this way, etc. And I do think that has had that way of approaching journalism has had wider ramifications for us, because we became accustomed in those years to not having to things not being interpreted for us. So subsequently, I'm just thinking to my land law work, subsequently when we had published Commission of Inquiry reports, I think as a country, as a citizenship, we were not, as a citizenry rather, we were not good at taking those commission reports and interpreting them. We simply saw them as kind of raw data, raw material. It's taken us many, many years now to work through how do we do this work of interpreting, because for many years that door that was close to us, that kind of work of interpreting was not possible given the kind of repression of the regime, etc. So they simply transcribed the case. And that was part of the theatre. So you received the case either through your newspaper or you watched it on the television. There it was simply reported as news, if I remember correctly. And people talked about it in the street constantly.
I can't think of any parallels really to that. It's quite remarkable. I don't know what the answer is to this. Given he was in the morgue for so long,
yeah.
So who paid the fees, and what does that say in terms of notions of belonging and ownership, I guess?
Such a great question. I don't know, but he was in the morgue for a very long time in Nairobi City Mortuary. And in fact, that documentary that I referenced, I didn't know this until recently, but Nairobi City Mortuary was referred to as Nyumba ya Otieno when the public transport buses were stopping at a particular, when they stop at particular places in the city, they give often kind of pet names to particular stops that often tell you an awful lot about the history and politics of a particular place. But they referred to this place as Otieno's home, which is also interesting, isn't it? They refer to the morgue as his home when, in fact, in the courts, what's being contested is his home. So the morgue also took on a kind of place in the public imagination. Who paid the fees for it? I do not know, but would be interesting in relation to commitment.
Well, and as someone who doesn't know much about this story, knows more now, but can you just give me a flavor in terms of where this sits now, years later, in the popular imagination, popular culture? Has this event, does it
get remembered? Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, I think Wambui Otieno lived on longer. She continued to be politically outspoken and active. She is, she's known as one of those very powerful Kenyan women who was outspoken and unafraid. She married a much younger man than her, which for a while caused massive controversy and an awful lot of misogyny about that. Do people remember the case? I don't know, and I don't know that younger people necessarily remember the case in the way that, say, we would, because it came at a very particular political moment. It came at the moment, just came on the cusp of the constitutional battle, struggle, which is why, again, I wanted to, in this paper, I wanted to join the reading of the Otieno case to the constitutional struggle, because I think there are kind of echoes there. Somebody like Mama Coco presages some of the language we used about the Constitution subsequently. So I don't think, I would be surprised if younger people knew about the case, and I would be surprised if even if they did know about the case, they didn't just accept or read it in these fairly stratified terms about ethnicity that I was relating to you. I don't think I don't think it's been sufficiently revisited. It's why I was so happy to revisit it in this way, both the text and the case, because I don't think it has been revisited and looked at. And I think with 30 years passing, you do see it in new light. It would be interesting, for example, to teach it to a group of law students. Very interesting to teach.
And do you know the answer to this? Did she go to the village funeral, and did she perform her wife rituals, or was she banished?
No, she never went. She never went, and she the family said apparently she would always be welcome here. No, and her children would always be welcome here if they want to come and visit their father's grave. And as far as I know, they never did. So there has been an actual, a complete gulf. So they've never, the children never, as far as I know, relate to their father's people. I think they saw it maybe from their mother's perspective and saw it as, this kind of remorseless attack on her. So as far as I know, that relation didn't continue, which is interesting when you think about the amount of social reproductive work she did precisely in that role of Pym to make herself part of that family.
Interesting. If there are no other questions, it just leaves it to me to thank you, Ambrina, for as always, your work is so richly textured and multi-layered, and it's just been a pleasure for me, and I hope, and for our audience to either learn or relearn this story. I feel really privileged to have heard the story, and I want to thank you for joining us today, for presenting it to us. Thank you also to our audience for your participation. This is our last seminar for the year. Great way to finish. But until we meet again, either remotely or in person at the Institute, thanks very much. I look forward to seeing you again. And it's been lovely to see you, Ambrina.
Lovely to see you. And thank you, Carl, for all your questions. And thanks to everyone for coming.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
All the best, and bye for now.
Bye.